All right, in this video, we're going to look at working with factorial notation. So in our last video at the end, we looked at a recursive sequence where we took the previous term times the term number. And that actually segues into what we're going to talk about in this video, which is factorial notation. So products of consecutive positive integers can be expressed using what is known as factorial notation. So if we have a positive integer n, then n factorial, which is just an exclamation point after n, is we start with n and we count down to 1 and multiply everything from 1 to n. So for instance, if n is 5, n factorial is 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. By definition, 0 factorial equals 1. And one of the things that you want to keep in mind with factorials is they grow very quickly in terms of their values. So the outputs, because we keep multiplying by a bigger number each time, we go up the scale here. The outputs get pretty large pretty quickly. So as we can see, 1 factorial is 1, 2 factorial is 2, 3 factorial is 6, 4 factorial is 24. But notice that each new factorial, such as 4 factorial, is 4 times the previous result. So we have 3 times 2 times 1. So 4 factorial is 4 times that 3 times 2 times 1, or 4 times 6, which is 24. 5 factorial is 5 times this result of 24, which is 120. Then 6 factorial is 6 times the previous result of 120, which is 720. So notice we see these same patterns in each new factorial. So unless grouping symbols like parentheses involve, factorials are only going to affect the number or the variable that they follow. So for instance, 2 times 3 factorial is 12, but 2 times 3 in parentheses factorial is 720. So example 3, write out the first 4 terms of each sequence. We have a sub n equals 2 to the n over n minus 1 factorial. We're going to start with n equals 1, and when we do that, we end up with 2. And here's a good case of why 0 factorial equals 1. We would get division by 0 if it didn't. There's a couple different ways of explaining it, but I'm going to not do that for the purposes of this video. Plugging in 2 for n, a sub 2 is, we end up with 4. A sub 3, we end up with 4 again. And then a sub 4, when we plug that in, we end up with 8/3. So our first 4 terms are 2, 4, 4, and 8/3. Part B, we have b sub n equals 20 over n plus 1 factorial. So plugging a 1 in for n, we get 10. Plugging in a 2 in for n, we get 10/3. Plugging in a 3 in for n, we get 5/6. And plugging a 4 in for n, we get 1/6. So our first 4 terms are 10, 10/3, 5/6, and 1/6. Now, when simplifying factorial expressions, it often helps to remember what factorial means. We start at the value that is in front of that exclamation point. So for instance, if we have, let's say, 10 factorial here, then it's 10 times 9 times 8 times 7. We just count all the way down to 1 and multiply. So example 4, simplify each of the following n plus 1 factorial over n factorial. Well, once again, let's look at what it means for factorial. For n plus 1 factorial, we start with n plus 1, and then we're going to take 1 away each time. So n plus 1 minus 1 is n, and then subtract 1 from that, we get n minus 1, n minus 2, and we keep going and going and going until we got down to 1. Now our denominator is n times n minus 1 times n minus 2, all the way down to 1. So notice we have these n's, these n minus 1s, these n minus 2s, and it would all the way down to 1. All those values would cancel out, leaving us with just an n plus 1 over 1, because if all these terms cancel, there's a 1 in their place, and n plus 1 over 1 is n plus 1. So for instance, if n is 7, this would be 8 factorial over 7 factorial. That would give you 8. So part B, n factorial over n minus 1 factorial. Well, Once again, let's write out what it means for factorial. N factorial is n times n minus 1 times n minus 2. We just keep subtracting 1 each time. Eventually, we'll get down to 1. N minus 1 factorial, we start with n minus 1, and then we subtract 1 from that. We get n minus 2, n minus 3, all the way until we get to 1. So we'll have these cancel, everything kind of cancel. And all we'll be left with, careful you might miss it here, is n over 1, which is just n. All right, so that about does it for this video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.